Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Melanie Korn, and I'm the president here at Columbus College of Art and Design. I'm so delighted to have you all here in the audience with us tonight, and CCAD is really honored to be a community partner and be able to help bring such an incredible author like Celeste Ng here to Columbus. So I want to just say very quickly, I hope that you all come back and see us often. CCAD has many events and opportunities that are free and open to the public. You walked past, when you came in, Beeler Gallery that has a rotating group of contemporary art exhibitions. We often have many artist events and lectures. So please do come and see us. You can always learn more about what's going on here at CCAD by just going to our website, ccad.edu. It's pretty simple and straightforward. And one quick event note that I want to share with you, that we have another author coming here to CCAD soon. Saeed Jones will be here on November 10th. I know that Gramercy is also hosting Saeed Jones, but I think that is sold out, so you can come. If you didn't get a ticket for that, or if you want to see him twice, come to CCAD on November 10th in the evening. Again, you can get information on our website, but it's free and open to the public. And his new book is our first year reading, so we're making sure all of our students are keeping up with what's going on with Saeed Jones. So again, delighted to be here, delighted to have you all, and it is my pleasure to turn things over for an introduction to Linda Cass, the founding owner of Gramercy Books.
Melanie, and thanks to the willingness of Columbus College of Art and Design to be our venue host and partner inside this magnificent Kanzani Auditorium. It's wonderful to see you all in person again. Gramercy Books is very thrilled to feature #1 New York Times bestselling author Celeste Ng and her powerful new novel, Our Missing Hearts. And we're equally excited and grateful to have Celeste in conversation with beloved Central Ohio poet and essayist Maggie Smith. I want to recognize Ohioana Library for joining with Columbus College of Art and Design and Gramercy Books to present tonight's program. Along with CCAD President Melanie Korn, I want to recognize Provost Julie Taggart and Dean of Grad Students Jennifer Sluter, who are here tonight, and special thanks to Rochelle Simonson, AVP of Operations at CCAD, for working so diligently with us on facility logistics. And thank you so much for respecting our author's request for wearing masks tonight and showing proof of vaccination when you arrived. It is very much appreciated. To preview the next hour, after my introductions, Celeste and Maggie will discuss Our Missing Hearts for about 40 minutes. We'll have 15 minutes for questions and answers that many of you submitted in advance. And finally, Celeste will sign your copies of Our Missing Hearts following the program in the lobby. Gramercy Books continues to offer weekly author events for the community to enjoy. You can find our full author programming on our website at gramercybooksbexley.com. Real quickly, coming up very soon, we're going to be hosting Jerusalem-born novelist and poet Muriel Rothman-Sepper, former Ohio Governor Richard Celeste, although that event also is sold out, award-winning poet and essayist, as Dr. Korn mentioned, Saeed Jones, that's sold out, and New York Times bestselling author Ross Gay in conversation with Hanif Abdurraqib, and so much more. Sign up for our e-newsletter to stay up to date, and you can find out all kinds of things about what we have for adults and children. And now, on to tonight's program. In Our Missing Hearts, Celeste Ng has created a dystopian near future that both reflects and amplifies our current anxious realities. It is a deeply suspenseful and heartrending novel about the unbreakable love between a mother and a child living in a society consumed by fear and governed by laws written to supposedly preserve American culture. The book explores the power and limitations of art to create change, the lessons and legacies we pass on to our children, and it asks how civilized communities can ignore injustice and hate. This evening's special guest author, Celeste Ng, is someone who doesn't really need an introduction, her novels being so well known. She's the #1 New York Times bestselling author of Everything I Never Told You and Little Fires Everywhere. Our Missing Hearts was published earlier this month by Penguin Books. Celeste is the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim Foundation. Her work has been published in over 30 languages. And just recently, she's been named the American Booksellers Association's inaugural ambassador, continuing her longtime advocacy of independent bookstores like Gramercy Books, and we are so grateful for that. Tonight's conversant is someone familiar to Central Ohio audiences through her poetry and essays. Maggie Smith is the author of several books, including Good Bones and the national bestsellers Goldenrod and Keep Moving, Notes on Lost Creativity and Change. Her memoir, You Could Make This Place Beautiful, will be published by One Signal, Simon & Schuster in April 2023. Maggie's poems and essays have appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Guardian, Paris Review, and others. She's on the MFA faculty of the Naslund Mann Graduate School of Writing at Spalding University, and she serves as an editor-at-large for Kenyon Review. Let's now welcome to the stage Celeste Ng and Maggie Smith. I think we're on.
Yeah, okay.
We're on.
If you start to not be able to, this is my fault because I wore this drapey shirt and I did not think about the tech guide. If you start to not be able to hear me, seriously, just like start waving your hands. We'll fix it. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to the college and to Gramercy for hosting, and thank you in particular for wearing masks and caring for each other in that way. I'm taking my mask off while we're on stage because I think it's easier for people to hear me when you can see my mouth. But please do come up to the signing table afterwards and say hi, and I will have the mask back on and we can chat COVID safely. And Maggie, thank you so much for being in conversation with me. I'm so excited to talk with you.
Well, this is great. We're going to just have a conversation that all of these kind folks will eavesdrop on.
Yes, exactly.
Although I do have questions pre-submitted, which I may just kind of pepper through. So you may, if you submitted a question, hear it throughout the next hour. How's that? Okay. Do you? These are strange times, Celeste. Where to begin? This book. Oh my goodness, this book. I think I want to begin with congratulations. And I also want to say thank you. As I've called this book required reading. I think it should be required reading. So for the non-novelists of us in the house, which I'm one of, I want to know, how does this start? How do you make this? What is the little spark? Because I know how this works with a poem. I see something, I hear something, a scrap of dialogue, an image. Where was the little seed for this book?
The seed for this book really started off with the mother-son relationship in particular, and then it went to sort of the family relationship. My second novel, Little Fires Everywhere, has a creative mother in it. She's a visual artist, and her daughter really understands her mother's need to create art, and I think puts up with quite a lot in order to let her mother sort of do the work she feels drawn to do. And while I was writing that, I started thinking, what if that relationship wasn't quite so harmonious? I think fiction writers are drawn to conflict and trouble. And so I started thinking, what if there was a creative mother and her child didn't really understand why his mother felt the need to do this, and maybe even saw her art as a rival for him, or something that was taking her attention away from him. And so I was thinking about that right after I finished writing Little Fires Everywhere, and the idea was still kind of squishy and starting to form, and that was in October of 2016. And so pretty soon thereafter, some things happened. And, a few things happened. In addition to the presidential election, I think we started to see a lot of normalization of sort of hate and a lot of anger. And then also, I think, a lot of, really understandable anger about systems and problems that have been there for a long time. And so those things kind of ran into each other for me. But it always started with the family, and it always started in particular with his mother and the son.
I think what struck me most about this book, and if you were in the audience and you've already read it, lucky you. If you haven't and you're going to pick up a copy to read tonight, lucky you, because it's ahead of you. But what struck me most, I think, about this book, other than the beauty of the sentences themselves, which I don't know, I'm a poet, so.
Yeah, that means a lot coming from you.
I'm very picky about sentences. So if I enter a book this long, I really want every little paragraph to be a poem, and spoiler alert, they all are. But what really struck me reading it was how the sort of dystopia in this book in some ways isn't a dystopia. It's an awfully, painfully sort of close to the America we live in, sort of dialed up version of America, and it feels not so futuristic or not so far off from what we're living. Yes?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's been described by reviewers and by other readers as dystopian, and I guess technically that's sort of right if dystopia means that things have just gone very wrong. But I think of it as exactly as you said, that it's more like our reality with the volume turned up a little bit, and maybe not even that much. It's a world in which there's been a recent crisis. There's been an economic crisis that turned into sort of a lot of social upheaval. And one of the ways that the country in the book has gotten through this is to create laws that demand that everyone act unpatriotically. And if you are seen to be acting unpatriotically, the government can take away your children. And you can imagine immediately the ways in which this might go very wrong, and in fact does. It gets applied a lot to Asian Americans, particularly Chinese Americans, because China is being seen as the scapegoat. And then it's also applied to anybody who sort of dares to speak up on their behalf. And like you say, that exactly is not happening. But we're seeing all of the other things, those are happening. What books you can read are really being restricted. And we're seeing that happening now with attacks on libraries and schools and in cities about books that certain people think are dangerous. And we also have seen a really shocking rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. It's not a new thing, but after the pandemic, there was a really noticeable spike, and there still is. And likewise, I think we're seeing just a lot of uncertainty and fear about where the world is going, and that's sort of the world that we're in. So if the book is dystopian, I think we might also be dystopian.
I think we're dystopian. Yeah. I mean, reading it, I thought, well, how far off is this from what's happening with the families of trans children, and how different is this from what's still happening at the border, and how different is it really? How can we say, but we're better than the version of us in this book when it doesn't seem so far off?
Those are comparisons that I've been thinking about a lot as well. If you read any of the news about what's happening in a bunch of places, but Texas in particular, parents can now be prosecuted if they affirm their child's gender, for example. And the idea that the state sort of decides, oh, your parent is a danger to you and takes you away, it's not fiction. Margaret Atwood famously said when she was writing The Handmaid's Tale that she didn't put in anything that hadn't had some sort of historical precedent. The line that I love, because she's Margaret Atwood, she said, if I were making an imaginary garden, I wanted the toads in it to be real. And I think that's such a good way of putting it, and that was the kind of guideline I gave myself as well. I didn't want readers to read this and be able to say, oh no, that's completely made up. That would never happen, because all of these things have roots. I mean, they have precedents in history.
So if you were writing this in 2016, in 2017, in 2018. Do the math, it takes a long time.
I'm really slow. Yeah.
I write poems, so it's a little bit different. I can get to the end on a page, you know, it's pretty quick.
I'm so jealous of poets for that reason. Like, you can feel like you did something, and I'm like, yep, still got about the same number of pages.
Maybe, but then I see novelists on Twitter like, I wrote 2,000 words today, and I maybe like took 5 words out of a 14-word thing and put 3 words back in, which feels like playing with blocks sometimes, you know. I'm wondering if, especially as we entered 2020, did current events impact or shape the plot?
It absolutely did. I started this novel in 2016, as I said, but part of the reason, in addition to the fact that I'm apparently a very slow writer, part of the reason that it took so long is that I didn't know how to put this book together, and I also didn't know if I wanted to write this book. I actually was working on another book at the same time, and I would sort of ping pong back and forth between them. I kept coming back to Bird and his mother and his father and this world, and then I just didn't know what to do, and the real world sometimes felt way too close. And so I would put it aside and I'd work on this other piece. And in fact, it wasn't until the pandemic that I really sort of focused my attention on this book. I'd actually talked with my agent about it, and we'd agreed, okay, I'm going to work on the other thing. We're just going to deal with this weird Bird situation later. And I think it was maybe in April or so, when we were all kind of locked in our houses and no one really knew what was going on, I emailed my agent and I said, okay, I know I'm supposed to be working on this other book, but I think I might need to work on this one. Please don't be mad. And she wrote back, I actually was going to email you the same thing. I feel like this book feels like the one that's calling to you right now. And so it was really then that I started working on this. I think part of it was, we were just chatting backstage about the pandemic and how it's affected our kids and so on. I think part of what encouraged me to write this book was that I suddenly could feel in some ways what it might have felt like to be the characters. I read about what it was like to live in an atmosphere of fear, but I felt like we were finally starting to, we were in that. If you kind of think back to March, April, May of 2020, what I remember was this feeling that everything might be a threat. We didn't really know what to watch out for. I mean, and many things were a threat. That's exactly what I was thinking. Where we were like wiping down our mail, or people would say, if you don't have wipes, because they were really hard to get. Remember that? Like, you would go to the store and there was no bleach. There was no, there were no Clorox wipes. Like, there were empty shelves, right?
Bread.
There was no bread, right? Like, canned goods, nobody could get any, like, yeast or flour, right? Like, there was this thing that I think most of us are very lucky that we've not experienced that before. And I remembered sort of thinking, oh, everything feels dangerous. I don't know if it's okay to, like, see my neighbors. I don't know is it okay to go to the store? What do we need to do to protect ourselves? That sense of really being alone, I think, really kind of opened something up for me. I think that's how Bird and his father are feeling, especially at the beginning of the book. They're living in a world where no one really trusts anyone. And in particular for them, it's somewhat dangerous. Bird is mixed race. His mother is a Chinese American poet, and his father is a white American man. And this is a world that's really dangerous for people of Asian descent. And thinking in that way, even before we started to see the inevitable attacks on Asians, it made me sort of feel like, okay, this is something that I need to work through on the page.
I mean, it's timely, but it also feels unfortunately sort of timeless, and that it's also a pattern that when something particularly bad happens in this country, we look toward who we can blame, and so much of patriotism ends up being a sort of like even the idea of America first, right? It's us, not them, or us versus them. And then who's the them? And finding yourself to be the them in this country is not a safe place to be.
That's a pattern that we see so much, I think, in history, and I really wanted to sort of acknowledge that these were patterns, that I wasn't making these things up, and also that it had happened before. And so I did a lot of research. It was interesting to do research during the pandemic because I would, at least for a while, our library was closed. And so I was just ordering books from bookstores, and then later I would get stacks of books from the library, and I'd bring them home, and my husband would see, like, I've got, like, The Origins of Totalitarianism, and then I've got on Tyranny.
Light reading.
Light reading, and I've got, you know, sort of like, France during the Third Reich, and he's like, is this really what you want to be reading right now?
In between bleaching your nail.
Right, and he had a point, but at the same time, I did find it, comforting is not the right word, but in a way, it was sort of bolstering to remember that these things happen, they have happened before, and that people always have still kind of worked against them, right? It reminded me that even when things look pretty bad, Third Reich, pretty bad, there were people who still cared and who were still trying to do what they felt was right, and that, you know, they managed to hold on to hope in the face of all of that. And I don't know how they managed to do it, but it was a reminder to me about how important that is.
We're still doing that,
Yeah.
aren't we? And books is part of it, I think. A couple of the things I really admire this book for is how you grapple with, you just tackle big things. What are we willing to trade away for the myth of security or safety or belonging? If you play nice, will they leave you alone? If you assimilate better, will you fly under the radar and be left alone? And also just this idea of the responsibility we should feel toward others. There's a moment pretty late in the book where there's a conversation about, like, well, if it's not happening to you, then it's okay? No, it's not okay if it's not happening to you. If you see something, what is our responsibility to sort of stand up on behalf of others? That feels incredibly important right now.
I mean, that was something that I was really asking myself throughout the writing of this book, not only during the Trump years, but also during the pandemic, and then also during a lot of the protests that we were seeing around police brutality. The question of, when does it become my problem? Is it only my problem if I personally am getting hurt? And I have to think the answer is no, right? I mean, one of the things that I think the pandemic certainly has really shown us is that we're interconnected with each other, whether we like it or not. You know, we live in a society, unless I suppose you are one of the people who goes out and lives in like a cabin and you generate your own everything and you never see anyone. But that's not most people, right? Most people live in a community. And that idea that this is an us problem and it's something that we need to work on together, I think it makes the problems sort of not more manageable, but in a way you know that it's not something that's just about you. And to me, that's a really encouraging thing, to say, like, okay, we're in this together, we gotta work on it. It's a big problem, but it's not just a thing that I have to do. Conversely, like you said, it's not just something that I can ignore because I am less likely to get stopped by a police car, for example, or I have not personally been harmed by this, so good luck, parents of trans kids. You know, in a sense, I think there's a way of feeling like you are part of a larger group that I think we need to get back to. Or two, I don't know if back is the right word. I don't know if we've ever been in that space, but maybe we need to move towards it.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe the pandemic, at least for, as if it's over, it's not, but I think the sort of peak pandemic was a time when I felt more connected globally to other people, because I just thought, oh my gosh, people, I can't speak the language, I've never been to these places, and yet we're all kind of going through something similar.
There was this sense of being all in something together, and I think that is somewhat dissipated in a way. Again, however much it was there before. But again, I think that reminder that I think what we're really talking about is connecting as humans, right? Outside of, your national boundaries or outside of, your particularities, just being like, we're here and we're trying to get through this together. And that's something that we have to do as a group.
One of my favorite characters, can you guess? Yes, it's Sadie. Why do I love her so much? It's like the feistiness, it's the willingness to speak truth to power at a young age. I just attached to her character so much in this book. And it just made me think, as someone who doesn't write characters, I'm wondering sort of how they come to you. How does a character come to you? Do you get a sort of physicality of them first? Do you hear a voice? Do you get a sense of their body language and mannerisms? How do you choose their names? Because it sure seems like, Bird's real name is Noah, and that feels like it's got some metaphorical freight to it. So I would just love to pick your brain about that.
As does Bird.
Yeah.
I love this question because it's such a poet question where I'm always like, how do you end up how do you deal with the turn? How are you so concise? And the poets are like, how do you make a plot?
How do you move people from one place to another? Because I've never figured it out.
One of the things that I've learned about moving people from one place to another, which I think of as like stage business, it's like exit left, is that usually you just I write it and then I just take that part out and you make a little space. And like downstairs, he opened up the cabinet. White space.
Like, it's a stanza break.
It's right. So this is where we're realizing that poetry and fiction have more in common.
It solves so many problems for me right now.
So the question of where the characters come from, I'm glad you liked Sadie. Sadie is one of Bird's friends, and she's also been separated from her parents, although in different circumstances. And she's feisty. She is kind of she's scrappy in a lot of ways. This is one of the things that makes fiction writers sound a little bit off, but Sadie was a character who just kind of like elbowed her way into the story, and if any of you have read the book and encountered Sadie, you will know that is her personality. I was thinking about Bird and what his experience might be like, and I do a lot of what I call writing off of the page, meaning that I open up a new document or I turn to a new page in the notebook, and I just let the characters talk. Or I write about them and I describe what they're doing, what a typical day is, or what one particular memory is. So I started writing Bird at school, and this girl popped up who was his friend. And where Bird was shy, as you'd expect from a character named Bird, and maybe a little bit hesitant and a little bit reluctant, this girl kind of just walked in and would just say things. And when he would kind of try to shy away from difficult subjects, she'd give him a little push. And she'd say, how can you really think that? How could you not notice that was going on? And so I don't know where she came from, but I feel like she was a fun character to write because in some ways she's I think what many of us would like to be, in that when she sees something happening that she knows to not be right, she kind of jumps in and she speaks up, even when there is a cost for her. And with the other characters, likewise, they kind of wander in from the wings in a way, and sometimes I have to be a bouncer and go, you don't really sorry, you seem really cool, but you really don't belong in this scene. And see, this is the thing that makes fiction writers sound a little weird, and I guess we are. But in a lot of cases, I do approach the characters almost like they are people that I'm meeting and I'm getting to know. I said that I started off with this father and mother and this son, this little nuclear family. And I knew that they didn't see eye to eye. I knew that there were things that the son did not know about his parents, but I didn't totally know what they were. I had ideas. And I would write about them, and I would get to know them just as you get to know a person that you might meet at a party. You say, what's your name? What do you do for work? And then you say, what part of town do you live in? Oh, okay, that's interesting. What brought you to that line of work? Oh, okay. Oh, so you don't actually like it. Why did you go into that line of work? Oh, your dad did that. Are you close with your dad? Oh, you're not close with your dad. why aren't you close with your dad? Right, you start saying, is this not what other people do?
I love this. It's fascinating.
So I'm by nature an introvert. We were talking about this backstage, and I learned from one of my friends who's also an introvert, but is really good at camouflaging it, that a lot of times if you ask people about themselves, they do all the talking, and the conversation is great, and you learn a lot of really interesting stuff, and you don't have to talk. But so this is what I do with my characters in a way. Once I get a sense of who they are, and I get a sense of what their deal is, so to speak. Just as when you start to know someone really well and you become friends with them or not, you get a sense of what they would do in any situation, right? You're like, oh my God, if my boss were in this situation, I know exactly what he would be doing right now. And that's how the story comes out for me. So that's my answer to how do we do plot. For me, it always comes from the characters. And so I just get to know them as people, and then the story comes out from there.
What would so-and-so do next?
Okay, and then what would so-and-so do? And then what domino would that
That's exactly.
plot?
Well, I honestly, plot does not come naturally to me. So I think I told you this before. I wanted to be a poet when I was in high school, and
You chose so wisely.
well, I wanted to be a poet because I love many things about poetry, but I love how it can sort of laser focus your attention in on one thing. It does many things, but often it'll ask you to just pay attention to just one thing. And then out of that very small thing, which could be anything, like if you're Keats, it's like a Grecian urn or whatever. It could be really, literally the smallest thing, but often at the end of the poem, you feel like that one thing has opened up, and it has a larger meaning than it did, and I think that's so cool. And fiction writers will take like 200 pages to hopefully do something like that. But so I wanted to be a poet, and then my poems kept getting longer and more narrative, and I realized that maybe I was not the right genre. So I switched. But even in grad school, I had a teacher who I loved. She would say to me, this is a great draft. You've got a great situation here. I'm really interested in what might happen. You've got interesting characters. You've got your language is good. You just need a plot, and then you'll have a story. And she was right, honestly. It is, I think plot is something that we recognize, but it's hard to sort of identify it. And for me, when I teach, what I tell students is it's one thing happens because of another thing. In a way, it's the way that we try to make sense out of the world. We're like, oh, okay, you got mad at me because I did this thing. Or, oh, I'm this kind of person because when I was younger, this thing happened, right? It's that sense that we can predict, or we could look back and understand some of what's going on. Like, I think that's a really human thing. We're trying to find cause and effect. You can see babies do it, right? When they throw a spoon off the table and then they watch you pick it up, back, and then they're like, huh, throw that off again. And then you do that a bunch of times, but they're learning is cause and effect, right? They're learning that if I do this, the spoon will fall to the floor. And they're also learning probably she will pick it back up for me. But they're getting a sense of how they fit in the world. And I think that's what plot is for me. Not that you asked, but I do.
No, that's actually incredibly helpful, and probably for other writers in the room incredibly helpful, because in my mind, I'm thinking, well, probably this is all outlined and planned, and at some point you know how it ends. And I always go into a poem having no idea what's going to happen.
That makes me feel so much better, actually. That you don't know what's going on.
Oh, no.
It's also a process of discovery for me. I usually have an idea of where I might be going in the book, but sometimes I'm wrong. And I don't know how I'm going to get to, from point A to point B. And it is a process of discovery for me. I know there are writers out there who do outline very carefully, and I kind of envy them, because that just seems like it would be way more efficient. But I'm not one of them. I kind of follow the characters, and I see where it is that they seem to be going, and sometimes they surprise me, and hopefully that leads to surprise for the reader later on. It's only in the second drafts that I go back and I start going, okay, why would you do this? and I start kind of, moving the Lego pieces around. But at the beginning, like you, I don't know where I'm going. I just kind of jump in.
I love the idea that you could write something of length by maybe just sort of having a little miner's light with just enough light to kind of keep you shuffling a few steps ahead, and then when you get there, you shuffle a few steps more.
There's a saying about writing that I actually have typed up and hung on my wall, which is that writing a novel is like driving at night with your headlights on. So you can only see as far as your headlights, but somehow you can make the whole trip that way.
I love this.
And I think that's so true, and I look up at that, midway through a first draft when I really feel like I have no idea where I'm going. I'm like, okay, just right to the edge of your headlights, and then maybe I'll be able to see a little further.
Probably makes the day-to-day a little bit more manageable too, because it's like, well, I drove 4 miles today with these characters, and now we can park
Have a snack?
and rest.
Well, I was thinking about what you said earlier, writers who go and say, like, I wrote 2,000 words today, which is, like, actually a lot.
That's a lot.
I think they might be lying, honestly. But one thing is, too, it's easier to write those words in some way because you're like, I don't know where I'm going. I'm just kind of spinning out this thing, and maybe later we'll find out that we've driven 5 miles down the wrong road, and I'll turn around. But in some ways, that's part of the process, at least for me.
Okay, my next question is completely a moot point because it says, if you're like me, you don't know where a piece of writing is going until you arrive there. It's like I'm psychic. But I wanted to know, just specifically from a craft perspective, if there is anything about the writing of this book that surprised you. Like, did you surprise yourself? Did a character surprise you? Did something that came out of someone's mouth or something kind of like, oh, that's where we're going?
Yeah, I was surprised a couple of times in here, actually. Sadie was a surprise, and a fun one. There are a lot of fairy tales in the book. There's a lot of storytelling for any of you who've read it. Not just stories in books, but also stories that people tell to one another. Bedtime stories, but also, kind of whispered information that gets passed on. And I didn't realize how many fairy tales were working their way into the fabric of the book until afterwards. I realized that Bird goes out looking for his mother. I don't think that's too much of a spoiler. He thinks of himself in a lot of ways as a character in a fairy tale. Fairy tales often have, the youngest son who goes out to make his fortune, or, sometimes there's a sister who's going out to save her brothers. There's always this sort of quest, and that's how he frames it for himself. And I didn't realize how many fairy tales had worked their way in until I was revising. And not a spoiler, I promise. He goes at one point into a house that's been left alone for a long time. And I realized in writing it that what I was describing was like Sleeping Beauty and the prince going into the palace, right? Like the things that I had written in there, I was like, there's a rose bush. My subconscious put that in there in a way. And then the conscious me gets to go in and fine-tune it and tweak it up. So that was a surprise. And the ending of the book, which I won't talk too much about, the ending of the book was a surprise. I had an idea of what might happen, and I wasn't sure if I was right until I got to the end, and then I realized that that was what had to happen. It's again like when you get to know people, you're like, there is no other way that my boss could have behaved in this situation. It's like that. You're like, of course you were going to do that all along.
I'm going to go to some of your questions. This is a good one. Speaking of the end, no spoilers. Can you talk about the importance of bearing witness, something your novel expresses at the end? Yeah.
Thank you, whoever asked that question. I've been thinking about that a lot in past years myself, partly because of how turbulent I think our world and our society has been, but also partly because maybe this is part of becoming a grown-up in theory, which I don't feel like I am. I'm recognizing that there are all these really big problems that I'm becoming aware of, and yet they've been there for a long time. I just was lucky enough and privileged enough that I didn't have to think about them, right? In a way, that's part of why I chose Bird as a 12-year-old, because I think it's around that age for a lot of us that we start to recognize that, history didn't start with us, there was a lot of time before that and stuff that maybe we should learn about. And you also learn like, oh, maybe my parents had a life before me, and maybe they have a life outside of me now, and they're actual people, right? That sense of guilt in a way, of realizing, oh, there are these problems, and I just didn't know about them, but people have been fighting about them all along. That I think particularly felt close to home as I was watching a lot of the protests after George Floyd's murder. And these are problems that have been there for a long time, and I just got to not worry about that, you know. And so in some ways I wanted to put that in the book to talk about the need to sort of then acknowledge that these things happen, and again to witness things that happened. It also felt really important to me, as we were saying earlier, to acknowledge that none of these things are new in our history, right? I'm writing a book about Asian Americans, in part because that's something that I knew that I could talk about, but I didn't want anyone to come away from this with the idea that I was saying, oh, we were the first people to experience racism. You know, it could not be farther from the truth. And so in a way, acknowledging and witnessing, as the question asker said, was a way of just saying, here's the context, the big landscape in which we are, right? We're looking at this one part, but there's all this other stuff, and to just acknowledge that it's there. I think that is what witnessing is in a lot of ways.
And the book acts as an object of that. I mean, that's sort of what you're doing in the writing of the book. I mean, it also sort of, one of, I think, the core questions of this book is what can art do, really, right? I mean, and what can one voice do in the face of systemic pressure and problems?
That was a question that I was really asking myself a lot during the pandemic. I don't know if you felt similarly, but especially at the beginning of the pandemic, I was feeling really kind of useless. I was thinking, you know, if I had gone to med school, I could be a doctor, and I could be, like, very tangibly trying to help people.
I'm just writing poems in my house.
That's exactly what I'm saying. I'm just here with my laptop making up stories about people who do not exist, right? And it was kind of an existential crisis in a way. I was really thinking, like, is what I am doing of use to anybody? And one of the things that helped me through it was realizing that what I was turning to help me through, especially those early months of the pandemic, was art. I was reading poems that I loved. In fact, there's a poem that I loved so much that I typed it out and I hung it over my desk so that I could read it. I think it's just called Poem, but it's by Muriel Rukeyser, and it starts off, I lived in the first century of world wars. And then the next line is, most mornings I would be more or less insane. And it's about her, the speaker, as a poet, feeling what I was feeling, that she's living in this time of chaos. She's talking about how all of her devices are pouring out terrible news. She's talking to her friends, and they're also feeling like they can't do anything, and what do we do? And at the end of the poem, she gets to work, and she gets herself to work writing poems, and presumably this poem, by thinking about the nameless men and women who are out there, who maybe one day in the future might read some of this and see it as sort of like a light that's guiding them. And I like this poem so much that I not only hung it up over my desk, but I actually knitted it into a sweater. I haven't admitted that to people.
As a poet, I feel woefully inadequate right now.
Everybody took up pandemic hobbies, and knitting was one of my pandemic hobbies.
I did not take up those hobbies, Celeste.
Everybody was like, I'm going to bake bread, or I'm going to color, or watercolor.
No,
so
none of it.
What I took up was knitting, and I found this pattern that allowed you essentially, so if you don't know about knitting, there are two basic stitches, and essentially the pattern uses those two stitches to write Morse code. So mostly the sweater's flat, but then there are these little dots, and I couldn't think of something that I wanted to wear more. And so I put on that sweater on really rough days, honestly, because it reminds me of that. So the question of, does art do anything for us? It got into the book very organically because it was something that I was thinking about. I was turning to poems, I was turning to music, and I realized that art can kind of, it can inspire us, it can comfort us, but it can also just hold open a little space for the idea that maybe the world doesn't have to be the way it is. Maybe it could be something different. And I have a good friend who's also a writer, and I was complaining at a certain point that this book was not coming together, and my friend said to me, you have to give the problem of your novel to your novel. And what they meant by that was the questions that make it feel like you can't write the book are probably the questions that the book itself is trying to answer. So you just have to kind of lean into that. And they were right. And so in a way, the book is very actively questioning. Bird's mother is a poet, and one of the things she's wondering is, what can poetry do? What can art do? What can one person do in the face of these really huge problems?
Yeah, I don't know why I like this book so much. Like, these are things I think about all the time.
I wasn't sure if this would be a good conversation, but I had to. Well, this is where I get to embarrass you for just a minute. But I thought a lot. Also, one of the other poems that I read during the pandemic was your poem, Good Bones. And I know that I'm not alone in that. If any of you have not read it, I really encourage you to Google Maggie, read Good Bones, and then go buy her books, because they're all equally as good. But that was a poem for me about being a parent in particular, but trying to look at the next generation and going, how do I encourage you to feel like, okay, yeah, we can get through this, it's going to be okay, especially at a time where you are not really sure that it is going to be okay. And I think this book was my way of trying to figure out, how do you hold on to hope in that situation? In a world that feels very hostile, and like many things are very rapidly falling apart, especially if you are involved in raising a child. How do you go to them and say, I think it's going to be okay, or let's keep trying? And yeah, that's it. I'm like, I might be lying to you, but what's the alternative, though? The alternative is to say, this is just terrible, it's only going to be downhill from here, so we all might as well just give up now. But you don't want to say that, and you don't want to believe that, and so in some ways you have to figure out how you hold on to hope. And that, I think, is really sort of where the book came from in the end. That was what allowed me to finish writing it. It wasn't just about, here's how things are bad. It was about how, hopefully, we can find a way to keep going. Yeah.
There are a few more questions, and I want to make sure I can get to a couple of them. Some of these are specific. Ooh, here's a craft question. I love these. I have my own theory about this. Yolanda asks, what determines your decision to not include quotation marks or dialogue?
Okay, I will answer, but I actually do want to hear your theory.
It's less intrusive on the page to me, and it feels like, to me, I'm reading it and I'm like, oh, it feels more like a poem.
Oh, I like that. Well, poets often don't use quotation marks.
That's right. I tend to use italics for dialogue because I think it looks a little less, it doesn't draw as much attention to itself as speech.
So it was partly that, this is one of those decisions that I started making by instinct, and then I had to step back and go, well, okay, why am I doing that? Does that actually serve the book, or is it like one of those characters that I have to, bounce out the door? And I realized that I wasn't using quotation marks in part because the story is so much about, the book is so much about storytelling and oral storytelling in particular. And if you think about someone telling you a story, a long bar story or a bedtime story, stories around the campfire, this really cool thing happens where the voice of the person who's actually speaking to you kind of blurs with the voices of all the characters that are in the story, right? There's a feeling of the story being narrated to you, and I wanted the book to have that feeling too. I wanted the reader to feel like maybe this was a story that was sort of being told to them as well. And part of it is that idea that we're not stopping and putting up the little quotation marks. We're not stopping and saying, now, chapter 2. There are chapters in the book, but they're not numbered. And a lot of it was that sense of the story and your world, or the past and the present of the book, kind of blurring into each other. Great question.
Kristen asks, Little Fires Everywhere was such a wonderful television show. How does having a successful adaptation make you think about how the books you write would be adapted. Does it ever occur to you as you're writing how that might play out?
I'll be honest and say it doesn't. I try not to think about it, in part because I think film and novels, they're almost like different languages in a way. They have different rhythms. They use different grammar, so to speak. In a novel, you can have a character who is sitting and thinking and remembering stuff for a really long time.
Where's the plot?
Right? But on screen, it's really agonizing if people are just sitting there and thinking, right? And so I recognized, sort of early in the adaptation process that I wanted to let the people who knew how to speak that language do it because they were going to do it well and I would do it not well. And so when I'm writing, when I was writing this book, I tried not to think about how it might be adapted. And if it ever does get adapted, they're going to have all kinds of interesting problems, and I should apologize to whatever screenwriter tries to take this on. But I try to think of it really just on the page, and I try not to think too much about how it's going to be received, because at least for me, writing has to be kind of an inward process. And it's only after I've got a draft that I can kind of step back from it and see what I've got.
Someone wants to know what books you're currently reading, recommending, but as a last question, I want to expand that into just what is making you happy? What is bringing you joy? I don't care if it's like a lotion, a television show, a brand of shortbread. Like here's where we just talk about what's making us happy.
We're going to end on a note of happiness.
We are.
We all do that. So I'll start with books. Most books honestly do make me happy, but two books.
Sad ones.
Even sad ones, honestly. Two books that I have been recommending to everybody because I do honestly think that anyone out there would enjoy them. One is called Hell of a Book by Jason Mott. It won the National Book Award last year or the year before. I had no idea what it was going to be about when I picked it up, and it was tremendous. It was a page-turner. It's in part about a young black boy who's growing up in the South, and he's trying to figure out sort of the world that he's in. It's partly about an author who's on book tour, so that part, as you can imagine, spoke very deeply to me. He gets into a lot of scrapes that I hope he doesn't get into, or that I don't get into. For example, when we meet the author character, he's just accidentally locked himself out of his hotel room, and he's naked. I've honestly been very careful.
It's going to be fine.
We're gonna put something in the door, and I will be fully clothed every time I open the door. But it tackles really big issues. It looks a lot about the state of what it can be like to be a black man in America. But it is also really moving and really funny. I kept reading parts of it to my husband, and then after I finished, he took it and started reading it, and he started reading his favorite parts to me. So it is a book that it made me very happy as well as making me think. Another book that I've been recommending that has made me very happy is called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, and I see heads nodding in the shadowy figures of the audience. For those of you who haven't read it, it's about two childhood friends who reconnect when they become adults, and they start designing video games together. And you don't need to know anything about video games to enjoy the book. If you like any video games, even Candy Crush on your phone, I think you'll also enjoy a lot of other things. But it's really a love story about a long friendship. And I think we don't see a lot of those very often. About how you can be really close with someone and you feel like you know everything about them, and then suddenly you move off in different directions. And then if you're lucky, sometimes you come back together and you're different people and you have to figure out what your relationship is now. And so it was a really beautiful, like, it sounds super cheesy, but like it was a really life-affirming and like friendship-affirming story. And it also is a page turner. I think I finished it in like 3 days. And then other things that are making me happy. I really love this TV show called Dairy Girls. And its third season just came out. I only watched the first episode because my husband and I watched the first ones together, and then I was only home one day in the past few weeks, so we watched one episode. And I'm really looking forward to going back and seeing the others because it's hilarious. It's about a group of girls and one boy who live in the 90s in Derry in Northern Ireland during the time of the Troubles. But it's really just about teenagers and like the shenanigans that they get up to, and it starts really strong out of the gate and just gets better from there. So I feel happy. Yeah, I'm really happy about Dairy Girls. At an earlier reading, I was in Toronto, and a reader came and gave me a giant bag of Canadian snacks to welcome me to Toronto, which I was really touched by. And I also didn't know all these things were Canadian, but there's like all-dressed chips and like ketchup chips, which, yeah, I'm really excited to go and try them. So that's making me happy too. And then honestly, this sounds super cringy, but I am really happy to be here. I really have loved this conversation. I'm happy to get to go home and see my family tomorrow, but I'm also really happy to get to be here. It means a lot that, especially during the ongoing pandemic, that you all cared enough about books to come out and be here tonight. So thank you for that.
I don't know a better place to stop than there. Wonderful conversations, a novel again that makes us feel and think and hopefully act against injustice. So thank you for that, Celeste. And Columbus College of Art and Design, and what a great place to be in a College of Art and Design talking about art. And the Ohioana Library for being our community partners. Also, thanks to the Gramercy booksellers who were out there. I mean, they got me checked in and got the books here, and we love them, and so thanks to them. And Celeste will autograph copies of Our Missing Hearts in the lobby. So as you exit, we'd like you to line up in the hallway. So go out that door and just line up in that hallway leading to the lobby. And we really ask that you keep your mask on and keep a social distance during the book signing with Celeste. And we're going to provide you with Post-it notes to put in your book and put your name so that when we can get through the line pretty well and give us time to spend as you're up there with talking to Celeste. We're going to have extra copies still available for Our Missing Hearts as well as her backlist, so know that. And at Gramercy Books, we're open 7 days a week, 10 to 6, and we'll be open more hours, so come visit. Thank you so much.